What if I told you that one of the richest people in the world was living in a $2,000 a month house? Well, this man is not only broke, but he lived his entire life without owning a single property. He died having paid more than $70 million in taxes, yet never owned an asset. This man's name is Charlie Chaplin, one of the most successful actors and directors in history. And this is the story of how he lost everything. It all started when Charlie was just a child. Charlie was born in London in 1889, and he had a very difficult childhood. When he was just 3 years old, his mother became mentally unstable and was sent to a mental hospital. Because of this, young Charlie had to become the man of the house and raise his younger brother. Of course, it was really hard for him to do so, but he did his best. Despite all the effort he put into taking care of his little brother, unfortunately, their father still had to send the two of them away to live with other family members. But it wasn't all bad news, because while he was able to stay close to his father, who would visit him regularly, on the other hand, he didn't have to suffer anymore being apart from his brother. But despite being able to be with his dad, life was still pretty tough. That's because Charlie and his father were poor and they often went hungry. In fact, young Charlie would skip school every day just to get food at a soup kitchen. It seems like no matter what Charlie did, he couldn't catch a break. When he turned 14 years old, his father kicked him out of the house. And then after this, Charlie got involved with a gang of boys who stole things in the streets. Even though he made some money this way, it wasn't enough for him to survive. So he had to perform as a street artist, singing, dancing, and telling jokes for the public. He even joined a theater group and started touring around the country performing comedic skits. However, he didn't take any money from this, as he was still living off the streets. He had a very strict schedule. Every morning he woke up early and practiced slapstick routines for hours to make sure he was ready for his shows that night. After years of dedication and sacrifice, he finally got a chance to shine. He was invited to join a theater group called the 8-Day Film Company, which gave him his big break in the entertainment industry. He was eventually paid for his work, but his salary was $150 a week, which was still barely enough to pay for rent in Los Angeles. But things started looking up for Charlie, because he quickly became the main attraction of the show. In fact, when the company was renamed to Keystone Cops, it was precisely because of Charlie's success. But although he was getting some money now, that wasn't enough for him to start investing. And if he had done so, he probably wouldn't have become the rich man he was later on. After working for 2 years at Keystone Cops, he decided to go solo and produce his own films. The first film he produced was called Making a Living, which grossed $6 million. This meant that after paying taxes, he had around $2 million left over. With this money, he opened his own production company and started to direct and star in his own movies. The funny thing is that he charged himself a salary of $10,000 a week, which he probably deserved because he worked extremely hard. This meant that in a year, he was making around $520,000, which was a huge amount back then. However, his net worth didn't increase at all because of this. That's because he spent almost all his income on others. He would throw huge parties and invite all the people he met during the day. In fact, he was known for giving away expensive gifts to anyone he talked to, even though he could barely afford it himself. Another reason why he never invested his money was because he was afraid of losing it. This might sound ridiculous to us today, considering how much money he was making. But back then, it was normal for people to lose all their fortune through bad investments. For example, when the stock market crashed in 1929, more than 90% of investors lost all their money. So it's understandable that Charlie didn't want to invest. But unfortunately, there was another problem. Even though he earned a lot of money every year, he also spent a lot on legal issues. He was arrested multiple times for having relationships with underage girls. And while he never served any jail time, he had to pay large sums of money to settle the cases. These lawsuits drained his bank account and prevented him from growing his wealth. But despite all these problems, by 1936, he was worth $60 million, which was a huge amount back then. However, this was all about to change. That's because in 1944, the United States entered World War II, and since Charlie was a British citizen, he was forced to return to England. While he could have fought in the war, he was already in his 50s, so he wasn't physically fit to serve. Instead, he tried to contribute to the war effort by making propaganda films for the US government. But ironically, these films weren't popular at all. In fact, they were considered to be too pro-British, and even though his films failed, Charlie still had a massive impact on the war effort. In fact, he raised more than $100 million for the war through bond sales. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough for the government, and they continued to criticize him for being a foreigner. They said that he was only interested in making money and didn't really care about the war. Because of all the hate he was receiving, Charlie returned to the United States in 19... But soon after he arrived, he was summoned to testify before Congress about his personal relationships. Once again, he wasn't accused of anything criminal, but the government wanted to know about his past in order to see if he could be trusted. Of course, Charlie refused to answer any questions, and this ended up going against him. The media immediately picked up the story and began to paint him as a troublemaker. Soon after, he was called a communist sympathizer and was blacklisted in Hollywood. This meant that he couldn't find any work in the entertainment industry, and he was forced to live off his savings. Luckily, he had enough money to sustain himself for a few years, but he knew it wouldn't last forever, so he tried to make a comeback. He starred in several plays and TV shows, but none of them were successful. Eventually, he had to accept that his career was over, and that he needed to find a new source of income. In 1951, he moved to Switzerland and began performing in nightclubs. At first, this was just a temporary solution until he could figure out what to do next. But soon he realized that he actually enjoyed performing in small venues. In fact, he found it to be a welcome change from the pressure of making big studio films. That est, because he was able to connect with the audience on a more intimate level, and he loved the energy of live performances. But although he loved performing, he still needed to make money. So he began touring around Europe and South America. This allowed him to travel and see new places while still earning a steady income. But even with all these efforts, his money was slowly running out. By the late 1960s, he was down to just $2 million, which wasn't even enough to cover his annual expenses. At this point, he was desperate to make money, so he accepted any job offer that came his way. This included appearing in commercials, hosting TV shows, and even doing voice work. But despite all his hard work, he was still broke. That's because he had to pay large amounts of money in taxes. Throughout his life, he had paid more than $70 million to the IRS and another $30 million to foreign governments. These high tax payments are the reason why he never had any assets. So when he died in 1977, he left behind a complicated legacy. Some people saw him as a genius comedian who made us laugh for decades. Others saw him as a reckless celebrity who threw his money away. Personally, I think there's a lesson we can all learn from Charlie's life. No matter how much money we make, it's important to live within our means and invest for the future.